Yeah, we're live. I'm going to, oh, yeah, it'll adjust there. I think it'll be okay. I haven't used this for a little bit. So we are live. It's a 7:10. So let me put a little note here. Tell everybody, yo, what's up? There we go. Tonight we're going to talk about, I need to adjust this too. I'm out of practice here a little bit, I think. I got to, let's see, adjust this up, just a skosh. There we go. Now we're all set. Today we're going to talk about Junkyard Boost. You can see in the thumbnail that I posted that every time I go to the wrecking yard, which I try to go as often as I can. Unfortunately, this last time on my last trip to West Tech, I wasn't able to get into the wrecking yard. Usually, when I go down there, that's one of the first things I do. It's like therapy for me. I got to go in there and just kind of, if I can take. I say I'm only going to take like 10 or 15 minutes and just kind of cruise through the things and take a look and see what's there. But it actually turns into like several hours because I stop and look at all of them and like want all of them. And especially when I see, and that's what tonight we're going to talk about, is all of the boosted stuff. Every time I walk by something, like for instance, in the thumbnail, it's that supercharged Thunderbird, the Super Coupe, and it's a 30 or a 3.8 liter with the supercharger and the intercooler. And I really like in that particular one, has lots of coolness because not only is it a factory forced induction motor, which is always better because you always know when the factory does forced induction combinations, whether it's that Super Coupe or the Probe Turbo or the 03 Cobra, if you happen to find something like that on the Ford side, any of the Chevy side, the ZL1, anything like from the factory that has a turbo or a supercharger on it is good. But in the case of that Ford, not only did they use a roots blower like we saw on a lot of the testing that I did recently on the 3800 GM motor, but also in the Ford engineers decided, hey, look, not only should we have a root supercharger, but we should also have an air-to-air intercooler, which is really, really cool. So essentially you had to kind of flip the blower upside down and then blow into the intercooler. And it was, that's really cool that they went the extra mile to have a front mount, essentially front mounted air-to-air intercooler on a root supercharge application, because a lot of people don't do that. I mean, normally when you do packaging, if you see all the other factory stuff like the 03 Cobra, the Shelbys, or those kinds of things, normally they pack, or any of the modern Chevys like the ZL1 and the ZR1 stuff. Normally what they'll do when they have a roots blower, which is packaged nicely, where God and nature intended it, right in the middle of the V of a V8 where it should be. Normally what they do is package some sort of air to water intercooler brick underneath it. And that works fairly well. And especially when, you're limited in the packaging that you have. So you only have a certain amount of space and you have to fit all of that. And there's hood clearance to deal with and all of that. So you got to fit the blower and you have to fit the intercooler. And so there's a limit in how thick you can make the core and how much heat rejection you can get in the flow rate. You're balancing all that. For the OEMs, they make it work for the power output that they're trying to get. And it works very well, obviously. When you're trying to get lots of power, it's hard to make the core bigger. And, guys do things to improve the flow rate and all that stuff. So, my hat's off to stuff like that T-Bird, which is why I included that photo, because they went the extra mile and did a front mounted intercooler. And you don't see that a lot on roots blower stuff. You see that sometimes. Like the cool thing is at Bonneville, if you take a look at any Bonneville motors, they'll package the big, if they run a big roots blower, like if it's in one of the vintage classes, they'll run a big roots blower, 471, 671, 871, 1071, all the way up to 1471, but they'll mount it up in front, low in front of the motor. And that's especially for packaging in, aerodynamic cars where they're trying to do a Lakes or a Streamline or something like that, so that they can, you want to restrict the amount of, of size that you can do so that make the thing more aerodynamic, because that becomes critical at Bonneville. So if you can mount the roots blower up front and then you draw the air into it and pressurize it out with tubing, and then you can package an intercooler in there. Especially you would do an air to water, obviously, and not air to air, because again, if you do an air to air at Bonneville, you're having air flow through that. That's going to be more drag. That's just not a good idea. Air to water is the way to go. And you can also, like for Bonneville, like we did with the Civic, you can package ice water and have it super cool it. So my hat's off to the T-Bird thing, and that's really cool. But and all of this conversation started off with, as I'm walking through these rows at the junkyard, and you come across something like this, there's like so much want. So even though when I walked through, like I just did a bunch of testing and I ended up hurting that little L32 3800 Series 3 V6 motor with a supercharger on it. And I think honestly, it was probably not great to begin with, but you know, I take full credit or or full fault, depending on how you look at it, for anything that gets damaged while I'm testing it. That's on me. I mean, even if the thing was bad, I chose it and I continued to do it without checking it out and not doing all the stuff that I should have done, rebuilding it, whatever needed to happen to make it work and continue to test. So that's on me, and I got no problem with that. But still, you want to have, when you get those motors, even when I walk by and see something as simple as that supercharged V6, and I say simple, and I mean that not in its effectiveness, I mean that it's simple in that I see lots and lots of them. I mean, I see more of the NA versions, but I might, like the last time at the yard, I probably saw 6 or 7 of those supercharged versions. They weren't all the Series 3. Some of them were the Series 2 stuff, and maybe Series 1, depending on what year it was. Some of them were L67, some of them were L32s, but I saw a bunch of them. But even when I walk by those, I stop at every one of them and look at it like, okay, that's exactly like the other one that I just looked at. That's in a red car and that one's in a white car. But even if I didn't ever even notice the color of the car, that doesn't matter. I'm looking really at the motor because I'm kind of more of a motor guy. But I stop and look at all those. And the same thing when I walk in any of the ones that I'm looking at, it could be a Saab, and I'm like, okay, does it still have the turbo on it, or the PT Cruiser, or an Ecotec, or anything that I walk by. I remember walking up to a Mercedes-Benz because it had the compressor, stickers on the side of it. And I'm like, okay, cool, it's gonna have a supercharger. And I opened the hood, and it was an NA Mercedes-Benz that somebody had bought the compressor stickers and just stuck it on the side of there, because that makes every bit as much power as actually having the supercharger on your Mercedes V8. But I stop and check all of them. So if it has a turbo on it, I start thinking, okay, it has a turbo on it. We know kind of what size it is. That's a KO2 or KO3 or KO4 or whatever it is. Do I need that? What can I use that for? What do I have coming up that I could possibly use that? Well, why would I not just obviously bring that turbo home because it's a turbo? Or in the case of that supercharger, the thing that would interest me most, in that case, I would like that whole motor, because I'd like to test that too, because I've never run one of those on the engine dyno. But at the very least, even just the intercooler off the 3800 off of that 3.8 liter is good to have, because intercoolers are always good to have. It's good to have a whole stack of extra intercoolers that you're probably never going to use. But just look at the tubing from the intercooler to the supercharger. It says supercharger on it, and that in itself is a cool casting. So that's, that would be a great thing to have. And those are the things that I think about while I'm walking through the wrecking yard, looking at all, because I have to admit, and the poor NA motors, and I walk by and I check for all the big blocks. I check every one of the LS motors to see what heads they have on it. I look at all the cool intake manifolds, but I do find myself paying way more attention to the boosted stuff than I do to the NA stuff. Even though there are V10s, and I always walk through, where I seem to be most interested in the NA stuff is in the LKQ that I go to has kind of like a classic section. So they have all these old cars, like they'll have an MG, they had, and although it's not a classic, an L83 Crossfire Corvette was there, but they had the little Dodge 600 with the 2.2. They had straight 8 Packard motors. They have just all kinds of weird stuff. And when I go in there, I'm like, okay, I'm looking definitely at all of these things, because there might be Clevelands, there might be 400Ms, there might be all kinds of weird stuff. And even if I don't want that right then, I don't want to take it home, I do want to go look at it because it's a, you know, it's a slice of history, and you can think, okay, yeah, what can I do with that? That would be kind of awesome to make it run. What do I need to make that run? Oh, that's probably going to be too much work. And then I finally tell myself, look, you don't have room for any of these other motors, so you just need to keep walking and looking at all the other cool stuff. But on the boosted stuff, you know, you can find lots and lots of stuff in the rows, and sometimes I'm even surprised by where I find things while I'm walking through, because I will have forgotten that, oh yeah, that's right, that thing did have a turbo on it. And so, you know, that's the first thing you do. You go check and you look behind the motor or in front of the motor or wherever they package the turbo and go, oh yeah, that's still there. I probably need to get that. So let me know what your let me know what your go-to is when you're going to the wrecking yard. Do you stop and look at all the turbo stuff? You stop and look at all the blower stuff? Do you look for all the intercoolers? Like even over in the big full-size truck stuff, where you look at if you find turbo diesels, I check every turbo diesel. Does it still have the turbo on there? Does it still have the usually gigantic size air-to-air intercooler? And can I possibly package that in anything, even if I could just package it at the on the engine dyno? That's still a win for me, because then we can put a big fan in front of it and blow air across it, and it works very well. And they're usually, like a lot of the stuff, like the Ford stuff, are plastic tanks, so they're very light, you know, and they work well for the kinds of things that we're doing. Because a lot of guys, when we run air to water intercoolers on the engine dyno, which is a lot easier for us to logistically and to package when we're running stuff, but a lot of guys complain about that. They're like, hey, look, you know, that's not real world, because you can't be running that out in the real world. You know, there's too much of that heat soak going on, so you have to run an air to air. So I like to do that from time to time and show them, hey, look, at this power and boost level, we're dropping the temperature by 100 or 110 degrees. And guess what? Both of those end up doing that, and they both kind of work fairly well. But I do like to run them, occasionally run the air to air also up front, and we have a big fan going through it. And then that's why I go look when I go over to the diesel stuff, because those are usually, you know, big and will flow enough to, you know, make at least some fairly decent power. And some of the bigger turbo diesels will actually support a fair amount of power. And especially even if they're smaller ones, you can run twins on them. That's one of the things that we did way back with Muscle Mustangs, is you take two of the T3 turbos that were on the T-Bird and the SVO and stuff. And, you know, those only might they're not nearly size big enough for a V8, but two of them would work good. And actually, in that case, you probably could use four of them to make, or at least three, but you could make four of them to work fairly well on a healthy size, you know, 302 or especially a 347. But those are at the wrecking yard, and they were dirt cheap. So it's a good way to make power. And so when I walk through the wrecking yard, we see all that stuff, and it makes me stop and go and go look at it all and oogle and ogle it. And if you find a turbo, you know, the first thing is, it's just like when you see a ported head, you got to stick your finger in there and run around and feel a short turn radius, like you know what you're talking about. And then with the turbo, you reach in there and you immediately spin the blade. And you're like, oh yeah, that's a good one. That thing spins freely. That's a nice one. We like that one. And then a lot of times with the blower stuff, even like with the Ford and with that's one of the first things I check, like with the 3800, is you take the belt off and you just spin the blower. Okay, the blower's not locked up. That's a good sign. That's the first thing. Now we need to check, does the motor spin? Okay, the motor's not locked up. That's a good thing. And as it turned out, that wasn't enough of a check on the L67, because or the L32, both of those seem to be down on power, which is not unusual, because that's the other disadvantage of getting a complete forced induction motor from the wrecking yard, is a lot of times guys are not as nice to those and they've been detonated or, you know, run hard and put away wet, and they're like in the case of the 3800 stuff, both the L67 and the L32, both of them had worn the seats out, and they didn't seal very well. So I'm sure that these things were running very well and not making very good power, which is why we didn't even run them until we ended up fixing them. And then I ended up breaking it anyway. But so let's see what you guys got going on. I want to know from you guys, what is your what's your go-to stuff that you're looking for in the wrecking yard? Are you stopping off and taking a look at all the forced induction stuff? Okay, Brandon, Richard, I've got an 03 Terminator Cobra. Nice. Ported Eaton, 160,000 on it. Would upgrading the blower be a good idea? 600 wheel horsepower. There's lots of blower upgrades. Kenny Bell and Eaton. I'm sure that they have the bigger Eaton Superchargers. Kenny Bell and Whipple is what I was thinking. But I'm sure that you could put I think that has an M112 on it, and you could put an M122, or you could go with one of the 2.3 liter blowers that Magnuson has. Those will be a really good upgrade for those. An air to water is not real world. I ran an air to water on my Sprint and drove it every day for thousands and thousands of miles. What about boost levels versus plastic intakes? If you're talking about the plastic intakes, like on the LS, we've run 28 pounds on them. And the guys from Fast told me that they test them to like 40 or 50. So I think that you're probably good. What exhaust manifolds you run on a 351M for the turbo? You can run the stock ones, and especially depends on if you're not looking for a bajillion horsepower, the stock manifolds work just fine. Or if somebody has shorty headers, those also work. Demon Tech, so you specialize in VWs. The VW turbos, the factory ones, are really small. Although I did find one the other day when I was looking through my Sprint stuff. We used one of the factory 1.8T turbos on the Sprint motor, and it made pretty decent power. What's a good blow through carb? We use the CS Racing stuff, but there's also it's not Holly. Who has the Fuel Tech? Is that who it is? Yeah, I don't know anybody that's ever blown a plastic intake manifold up under boost. You'd be more likely to do that on a nitrous backfire. I drove a K-Series Civic. The K-Series stuff is really nice. James, what kind of power are you looking for? Your 3800, a GT 3582 would be good if you want to make like 600 or 550 or something. If you want to do less than that, then the 3076 is probably good. How far can you push the LS engine with 4 bolts per cylinder? Most of them will lift the head at 1300. That's not true. Ours was 1540 is how hard we did a stock bottom end. It has head studs on it. So it's not the fact that it has 4 bolts. That's not really a thing. You could make lots of power. Yeah, I do also look at all the modular stuff because I want to see if there's we look for you look for the gold standard and stuff. So you look for the 544 valve stuff. On the Big Bang 6-liter, we ran 2 T4 hot-sided S475s. Brian's out. Florida's was in the house temporarily though. The LSA blowers work good. They're just like every other blower. They're limited in their size ultimately. Let me see if I can adjust this down just a little bit. There we go. And you can port them, or you can go up to a bigger blower. Looking for a 5-speed G50 Porsche stuff. Yeah, you haven't found one of the, you haven't found a G50 in the pick your pole. Yeah, that's going to be hard to find. My Cobalt has an air to water and a daily driver to 300 wheel horsepower. Yeah, that's good. I really like those Cobalts. I think all OE turbos are internally wastegated. Yeah, it's a lot easier for them to package that way. What do you think of aftermarket internally wastegated turbos? They work. What you run into on an internal wastegate is the flow rate. Because I can remember porting the stuff on the T3 SVO turbos and T-Bird turbos that we used to do. We would port the wastegate because you don't have enough flow rate, so it won't control boost. Ultimately, when you go up in power, the internal wastegate becomes a problem, and so an external wastegate flows a lot more, so you have better control. But usually, the internal wastegate is sized for the smaller turbos. So it can work pretty well. So you look through all the Jeep stuff for the 5.9 stuff. Lightning was air to water also, just like the 03 Cobra. Lincoln 4.6 liter, 1983, 1993, maybe. My Subaru runs 19 pounds to factory plastic. Yeah, the plastic stuff is more than strong enough. I've never tried a Coyote intake on a Navigator. John, I don't think one side's going to be leaner than the other on the big block specifically. I look for performance parts like ignition coils, headers. We also look, when I'm going there, a lot of times we look for TPS sensors because we tend to go through those a lot, but things like that, IACs maybe. Oh, a twin M90 small block Chevy. I haven't seen that. So Adrian, would they blow up under boost or like a backfire situation? Dan, you look for change under the seat. That's because you're trying to forward that G50 transmission. What's the most rare of the other guys you've ever boosted? Probably the Sprint motor. The electric fans. Yep, those are good. I'm probably going to have to get one of those for the Nova. What minimum cylinder wall thickness would you say for a board 60? So why are you going 60 over on the 351M? Do you have to? I would stay at 30. I don't know what the wall thickness is on a 351M anyway. Yeah, the T4 hot side is more expensive because we had to buy exhaust. Well, we didn't buy them; they actually gave them to us. But the T4 hot side is an upgrade. But how much power are you trying to make? I mean, those two will make 1,000 horsepower each. So we just wanted more turbo than we needed. If you're only trying to make 1,000 horsepower, you just put one of those with a T6 on it, like the Summit one, or one S480 or one S485. Christopher, for ring gap, we use 7 thousandths or so per inch of bore. The water-cooled stuff tends to last longer. Like even that Dodge 2.2 liter, like I brought the Omni home on the trailer from West Tech, so I have it here at the house. And the factory stuff, the water-cooled, that's the Dodge engineers anyway, told me that that's one of the reasons that the turbos lasted so long. Marty, if on your single pattern question, if you have a single pattern that's 230, and you go to a 230, 240 or 238 or 242 or whatever it is, it will make more power on the top. And especially if you have a high ram and TFS 225 heads, yeah, you'd be better off with a dual pattern cam, especially with a centrifugal blower, because it's going to want RPM, and so the cam is going to want to do that too. We just did a test for Engine Masters where we ran a single pattern and a dual pattern cam, and the dual pattern cam made more power on the top, and the single pattern cam made a little more power down low, which is kind of what you'd expect. Yeah, the turbo Cobalts, I think, are probably even more powerful than the supercharged ones. Will a log style exhaust manifold work to turbo V8? Yes, it will. Anything that you do to route the exhaust to the turbo will make the turbo work. I've never seen anybody blow through an Edelbrock carburetor, but you probably could if you enclose it, like in the Vortec or Paxton enclosures. They have those, and then the carburetor doesn't need to be a blow-through carburetor. With a supercharger off the Cobalt fit the 2.2 with some help, so you can twin charge it. Well, by help, if you mean if we designed a completely new manifold with an adapter plate to mount the supercharger, then yeah, it could. As could any blower. You have an EFR 6758 on 22 pounds. Somewhere in the 300 plus range. Christopher, we're all figuring out how much we don't know. Yeah, the EFR turbos are not, those are not DNA GT45s, that's for sure. They're pretty pricey, but they're good turbos though. I used to go to the Orange County swap meet a lot, and then the Pomona swap meet even more, because the Pomona swap meet had more car guy stuff. But it turned out to just eventually seemed like it evolved, and I haven't been there in a long time. It seemed like it just evolved into retail guys selling stuff. I tested a lot of the Coyote manifolds on Coyotes, but not on the 5.4 stuff. Vern, I don't know what the 351M bore maximum is, because I don't know what the sleeve thickness is. The EFR has an internal blow-off valve too. An S480 can do 1,000 horsepower in a 5.3 pretty easily. And you would need, if you're going to run it on gas, like race gas, you're not going to do 1,000 horsepower on pump gas on a 5.3. So you have to run E85. If you're going to run E85, you need something big, like a 100 pound an hour, 1,000 cc. If you're going to try to do it on race gas, you could go with a little smaller injector because you'll need less fuel. You could do right at 1,000 horsepower flywheel on 80 pound injectors, but it's better to have more injector. I've not tested a 390 or 401 AMC, although while I was down at West Tech, they just ran a, I think it was a 440 cubic inch. No, I take that back. It was 408 or 10 inches, an AMC, and it did really well. It made I don't know, 610 or 620, I think. We would go on 5 liters. We would go 30 maximum on the late model hydraulic roller blocks. Jay, so Jay's question is, Richard, for non-drag race max RPM turbo motors, how do you usually match intake runner length to turbo boost? The boost and the runner length have nothing to do with each other. I don't match those at all. What you do is you separate the boost. You take all the boost, set it over here, and then work on the NA motor and go, okay, what intake manifold, what runner length has the runner length that I need to run in the effective RPM range that I want to run. So if you take an LS motor, a fast intake works really good on most of the LS applications to about 6,500 or so, depending on the displacement. More on a 4.8, less on a 6.2, but right in that range. Then you go, okay, I'm going to have a camshaft in there that's going to work with that intake and the heads, and I'm going to make power, up to 6,500 or so. then I'm just going to add boost to that. So and then the amount of boost that you add is just going to be how much ever power you want to make. So if you're making 500 horsepower from your NA one and you want to make 1,000, you're going to add about 15 pounds. I want to put 2 M90s on my 5.3. It's just a lot of intake work to do that. First time login, long time listener, first time caller. Yeah, the water cooled stuff does help them last a long time, because if you're old enough to remember or have read any of the books from Hugh or any of the turbo books from Corky or Gail Banks or anything, one of the things that they stress in all of the turbo stuff was that, okay, if you have a turbo motor, one of the things you have to do is, after you're done driving it around and you come to a stop, you have to let it sit there. In fact, they sold back in the day things called turbo timers. So you would go and shut your car off, except that your car wouldn't shut off. It would keep idling, and you could walk away from your car, and the little turbo timer would keep your car going, and then it would shut it off so that you cooled everything back down. And if you saw the video that I put up of the glowing exhaust, and that was just a supercharged version. And also Tom Nelson posted a really good one. He does better stuff than I do. But he posted a video like I have of the turbo stuff glowing red hot. You know how hot it gets, and it gets that hot when you're under boost. So when you're out racing around, all that stuff has to cool off. So, and this is especially true of non-water cooled center sections, which tend to keep the oil temperature fairly consistent. So you leave the thing running and idling for a while to let the thing, cool back down, and then you can shut it off. And that's one of the things that made turbos last longer. And that's one of the things that they used to sell. I don't even know if they sell those anymore, but they did back in the day. Yeah, the EFR stuff is not cheap. Yeah, the more you learn, the more you realize, the less you know. Do you have any generic timing charts for boosted Gen 3 Hemis? Need a baseline to get started? No, I don't. I based the turbo timing or the boosted timing off of the NA timing. So whatever the maximum amount of timing that it wanted, we create a curve. And the way that I do timing is we start very low. Maybe on an NA motor, like an NA Hemi, we'll start out at 20 degrees. And then we'll start adding timing. And we'll add timing until it stops making power. And what will happen is it will stop making power at the lower engine speeds at a lower timing level than it will at a higher engine speed. That's because that's just simply time. The engine spinning faster, we have to initiate the burn, the ignition sooner. So it's going to want more timing at a higher engine speed than it wants at a lower engine speed. So then you have an ignition curve built in. So maybe it only wants 22 down here, and maybe it wants 31 or 32 up here, let's say, and then you create this curve. And then what we do for boost is then we retard all of that. And we may take some extra away from the torque peak and lower, because that's going to be the problem area. But there's no universal thing based on boost, because the problem is that boost isn't the only thing that's going to cause detonation. Any chance of suggestions on round track? So like a 352 barrel late model kind of thing. I've done a couple of those. Do you need AN-10 fuel rail to make 1,000 horsepower? No, we've made 1,000 horsepower with a stock 5/16 fuel rail on an 03 Cobra. Uncle Squirrel's in the house. Waiting for the test on the BTR truck Norris cam. That cam works good. I've already seen the dyno stuff from what Brian did. He and I have talked about this for months now. Truck Norris cam test and go. What I'm going to do with the truck Norris cam when I test it, I need to get another LS motor to test it with. But when I do, I'm going to do something different with it. I'd love to send you some parts for the Ecotech testing. Yes, don't do that right now. I like the AMC stuff. I like the AMX, which is a car that I would like to have. Looking for an ideal combo to make 500 to 550. Oh, it's a 4-barrel deal. All the stuff that I was doing were 2-barrel ones. 550 single 4-barrel small block Chevy is a lot of motor. Jay, that's what you're saying is not accurate. Long runner length is good for low RPM torque. That's true, which won't work with a turbo that doesn't spool until you're past its optimal length. You will never be past the optimal length with the turbo. The extra torque that you're making down low is going to help spool the turbo faster than the short runner does. Stop equating the turbo and the intake manifold. The intake manifold is just a function of is just a function of RPM. Where do you want the thing to make power? And then you add boost to that. So if you have a curve that makes the torque curve that you want and the power curve that you want, and then instead of being 500 horsepower, you want to be 1,000 horsepower, you just add boost to that. And the longer runner length will help make the turbo more responsive. Turbocharging a 1995 Mustang 5.0 Cobra twin turbo setup for 600 horsepower. Two of the small little SVO turbos actually would do that, but two of the 3076s would certainly do that. No, we've run the diesel turbos. The whole set stuff works good, and the HX series, although I've not run those personally, but I'm told that people have. 107 gives chop, comes in sooner and lower vacuum, and 114 would be the reverse. So I have a 114 separation ground on a 107 center line, and it's still a VVT cam. San Diego's in the house. JE pistons. If I go nitro, would you recommend Cerakote? I'm the wrong guy to ask about nitromethane. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure about how those piston coatings are going to work with nitromethane because I've never tested it. Yeah, post Oilers. Yep. Yeah, the Regal had a factory one, Mike. That's right. Remote oil systems for remote mounted turbos. You got to make sure that they work. Obviously, there are lots of applications where they run them. I know Hellion, some of the Hellion stuff that we tested, they had the turbo mounted low enough to where that they had a pump for it, and a lot of the remote turbo guys are using pumps to pump the oil from the turbo, from the drain on the turbo, and you can just pump it back up into the valve cover. You don't have to pump it into the oil pan. You could pump it anywhere you want because now it's pressurized. So you can do that, and they work. The thing is that the pump has to be working. So you're relying on the pump to always be working. The shop owner where I work sent you my channel. We'll tell him thank you very much. You've officially reached back in the day. Back in the day might be yesterday, so that we're all there. Yeah, Adrian, the EFR stuff is not cheap. I remember the guys from Precision sent me one of their CEA double ball bearing super throwdown turbos, and I think that it was that or more, and it was ridiculous. Luckily, they sent it to me so that I could do testing on it, and it ended up doing, it was great for those guys because they probably got, I don't know, 30 or 40 or 50 tests out of it. So they were really happy with it, but I couldn't believe it when I saw the price tag on it. Do you have a go-to turbo info Bible book? A lot of guys read the Corky Bell book. That has a lot of information in it. Hugh McInnes has a turbo book. There's a superpower book. It's all much older stuff, though. Is an external fuel pump on a boosted 5.3. Oh, okay. I don't know what you're talking about. A stock 5.3 will have an in the tank pump. You can put an inline pump in the fuel line system somewhere. If that's what you're asking about, then yes, it is okay. A lot of guys will boost reference the regulator so that the pressure goes up. If you're talking about a carbureted combination, you have to boost reference the regulator because the fuel pressure has to be going to the carburetor, has to be 6 or 7 pounds if it's a carbureted combination, 6 or 7 pounds above whatever the boost pressure is. Aftermarket turbos are only oil cooled. That's not true. There's lots of them that have water cooling too. Yeah, the BorgWarner Matchbot, you can play with that a lot to get some turbo sizing information. Richard, I'm building an LS2 6-liter out of a Trailblazer SS 243 heads. That's good. Main studs, head studs. Can you suggest head gaskets running a sloppy stage 2 cam? Are you doing all of that because you're running boost? If you are, we run factory LS9 gaskets on boosted stuff or Felpro stuff. We've made 600 horsepower with 5-liter blocks, although I don't know about longevity there though. When in doubt, grab a Volvo. Yep. What size turbo can I use on my stock 5.3 with a Howard cam? The depends on how much power you want, as always, but the GT45 is a good 700 horsepower turbo. An AMC Pacer, I like those, and the Gremlins as well. What octane is 85% E85 pump stuff? E85 from the pump can range from 85. The octane, I think that what they're kind of saying is the E85 is rated differently in the octane than gasoline is, but it's the equivalent, I think, of about 110. Oh, Dan, they use anodized pistons. So do they hard anodize the tops then? The tires won't take more than about 550, so looking to ease the torque the motor makes and make a car more drivable off the corner. Any suggestions other than what intake manifold is it, Josh? If you're making 550, I'm assuming that it's a single plane. Yeah, you're probably pretty tight on the LSA on that thing. I would imagine most of those short track cams can can be just in the double digits on LSA. But yeah, you could run a wider LSA and that would soften the thing up a bit. Is the chat always about turbo or random stuff? It can be about anything, actually. Just the name of the chat is Let's Talk Turbos. I have some turbo 463 valve stuff up there, and they start out pretty good. I think ours started out at about 350, so you can make some decent power with boost. The 351 block is definitely stronger than the 302 block. Putting a Vortec supercharger, not a Procharger. Vortec and Procharger are different companies, but if you're putting a supercharger on your 350 ohms, that'll be good. Yeah, Dulcich is. I was just talking to Brule about Steve Dulcich, and we were talking about how awesome he really is. And a lot of people don't realize, because when you watch like Engine Masters, Freiberger kind of takes center stage, but and Dulcich is a lot more soft spoken. But Steve and I, Brule and I were talking about it, and we think that Dulcich is like the most underrated kind of Renaissance man in the automotive industry, because he does a lot of different things. I mean, he knows motors, he knows head porting, he knows interior, he knows paint, he knows rear ends, he knows transmissions. I mean, he knows a lot of stuff, and it's really impressive to be that well rounded. Would you recommend running a Molly additive to extend turbo life? I don't think so. What I would recommend is maybe more frequent oil changes. Richard, if you were to redo the sequential turbo setup, what specific turbos would you spec out to be more effective and efficient? I've never done a sequential turbo setup. I've done a compound turbo setup, and I wouldn't pick any different turbos than the ones that I picked. I'm not looking for it to be more effective and efficient. It was just done as a gee whiz thing. I wouldn't do compound turbos on an LS, because as we showed on the Big Bang stuff, you can make way more power than the motor will withstand. So if you can do that, there's no reason to need more pressure ratio like compounds do. Compounds are a much better deal on either a diesel application, and that works really well, or possibly if you're trying to do a really, really big turbo on a very small motor and you need to spool that thing up, then you start out with a small one and you can compound that. Otherwise, I wouldn't. Like I said, I wouldn't spec out anything different than what we used, because we were just trying to show what it does and how it works. And the turbos that I had laying around worked just fine. We run a Super Victor or a Hawaiian Team G. Okay. You could take some timing out of it too, down low. Is any supercharger budget when the adapters cost $1,500? Yeah, that's expensive. Robert, we normally use 530 oil. I don't know about coolant though, because we just run water on the dyno. $355 with a mild cam, a high rise. I need a lot more information than that to know what kind of power it makes. I'd need to know if it's a 355, what are the specs on the cam, specifically the duration, but I'd like to also know the lift. I have to know what the head flow is, what intake manifold is, all of that stuff. 2618 versus 434 forged pistons nitrous. Is the 626 worth the extra money? Well, it is worth the extra money if you're going to that level of nitrous use. Like, are you going to the all of it level? If you're running a 200 shot or a 300 shot, I wouldn't worry about it. If you're running a 500 or 600 shot, then you're going to need the extra strength. What are your thoughts on Promax heads? Take a look. I have videos up on Promax heads, and we use them on the big block. They work good. I think I've run their Ford stuff, and they work well. I have a stock small block Chevy 400. How far will you push it under boost? Not terribly far. I can't remember if I think we ran a Pro Comp block or Speedmaster block on the 400 that we did. And I think we've done 1,000 horsepower with that one. But I've never run a stock 400 block for all of that it's worth. Hyperprotective pistons stand up turbocharging just as well as the other stuff does. You just want to make sure that you don't detonate it. Welcome, Dean. So you're here to calm down after your low boost, big displacement. Compound turbos work the best when building over 30 pounds. I don't know that I agree with that. Sub-Zero, yeah, the MSD manifold. I've never run those crazy boost levels on import stuff. I know that some of the guys are doing, and that's the thing, is that every year things progress. Oh, well, 20 pounds, man, that's a lot. And then pretty soon it's 25, and then 30, and then it's crazy boost. And that's what I was talking about. If you have a small 4-cylinder and you're trying to run a turbo where you're trying to make 1,000 horsepower or 1,500 horsepower, whatever the number is, and to get there, you need this giant size turbo, and that motor's not going to spool it up very well, then having a smaller one in between those two things helps out. What supercharger is going to work well for a Hemi, I think, is the question. The supercharger that provides the power curve that you want. So a centrifugal is going to have a rising boost curve, the positive displacement stuff, which there are both of those available for that. So which one do you want? Do you want immediate boost, then a positive displacement like a Roots blower, like an Eaton or a Kenny Bell, that kind of thing? I don't know about external fuel pumps because we don't do a lot of that. The one that we run on the engine dyno is a Aeromotive. So you're running an M112. I think that I did a test, and I don't know if it's up in video form. I did an early B-headed motor where we did some mods to it, and we put cams in it. And I think I put the 262 cams, the same ones that we put in that 03 Cobra motor, and those will work good. No, I didn't go to the yard today. I actually started out at 4 o'clock this morning and drove home. Yeah, having a really high stall speed and anti-lag and stuff for drag race applications is kind of a different thing, but 80 pounds of boost at 0 degrees, then all we need to do is run our liquid nitrogen. If you think a 4.6 mod motor will have issues spooling a single S480, it will do it eventually. I wouldn't flow the fuel through the intercooler. You should see. I want to run a Sniper 4-barrel pre-blower. So does it have an intercooler under the M90? I wouldn't have fuel before the intercooler. If you have an air-to-air or air-to-water, I wouldn't put fuel before the intercooler. I wouldn't recommend that. A 455 Buick, everybody's going to tell you that you need an 800 carburetor or an 850, and if it's a 400 horsepower one, you don't need something that's that big. But we ran the 455 Buick that I had. I don't think we ran it with a quadrojet. I think we ran it with a small Holly, but I think we had to have an adapter though, because the intake manifold that we had was definitely quadrojet. Quad 4 versus K24, that's not really a contest, I don't think. Isopropyl alcohol and dry ice, negative 78 degrees. We need a negative 178. Do you run 2 fuel filters on the dyno? They have multiple filters. They have one before they have one in between the tank and the first pump, and then they have one before the filter, one before the intercooler pump also. I have run back-to-back cam tests on the Cobra stuff. Those videos are up. Those 262 cams, I think, push the power from 377 to 425. Yeah, my made of glass 4L60 was just fine towing the little Dodge Omni, even over the hills. Oh, you want to see the curves? I have those. What's a good cam to run on my 6-liter motor that's not stock? Well, you got to tell me what you want to do with it. You can run anything from a LS9 cam, which I wouldn't recommend, all the way up to something like that 469 comp cam that will make good power, but you're going to sacrifice stuff down low a bit. How small of a turbo can you get before you start hurting power? You're not going to hurt NA power. Well, I guess you could eventually, but the turbo sizing is going to dictate how much you can ultimately produce. Dry ice does not cool liquids very well. No, because there's a barrier around it. Do you have videos of blow through carbs? Yeah, we run blow through carbs with no intercoolers a lot. As a matter of fact, I have a video up where we ran a blow through carburetor with no intercooler and then added the intercooler on the big block, and adding the intercooler definitely added power, but it still worked without the intercooler. LS1 gap rings, you do 28 to 30 thousandths. Utah, it's actually more involved than that, more than just an early intake closing. Keep putting smaller turbos on until it stops making power. So you want it to not, you want to just shut the motor off? The thing about turbos that you're not realizing is, and a lot of people equate, like, okay, we have a 500 horsepower turbo, we have a 500 horsepower motor, so it's not going to add any power, except that it will, because the motor makes 500 horsepower at the horsepower peak. But what is it making down here at 3,000 RPM? Well, when you add the turbo, it would still allow this part to make 500 at 2,000 RPM. So if it can flow that, then you just would have a flat horsepower curve that's making 500, which means you're going to, at 3,000 RPM or 2,500 or 2,000, you're going to be making like a bajillion foot-pounds of torque. And that's what happens with small turbo stuff. Our foreign car turbos welcome here. You should maybe Google me and see, you'll see that I'm definitely import friendly. I've written many books, 3 of them on Hondas. I set lots of land speed records with lots of imports. The Civic went 227. Lots and lots of import stuff. All of it's good. All of it needs to make more power. I should be testing as a matter of fact, before I left, Ish was asking me about when are we going to run the RB25? And I want to. Okay, 2 more minutes. Every car is a turbo car. That's right. It just doesn't have boost yet. An inline 5, nice. Gas and diesel. Volvo, very cool. Mercedes diesel. I like the Volvo turbo stuff. I would like to have a Volvo wagon, a turbocharged Volvo wagon. That would be awesome. Did you see the 2JZ death metal charger? No, I remember hearing them and that they were going to build it, but I haven't seen it yet. Okay, guys, last question. Okay, Outlast Metal, you get the last question. Which is a better choice for a turbo, a T4 or a V-band single turbo 5.3 setup? If you take a look at the Y pipe that I made, well, Jason from JT Fab did, thanks Jason, made for all the single turbo testing that I do, or most of it, it ends in a V-band. And the reason that it ends in a V-band, not because we have a V-band on the turbo, but because we have a V-band that then goes to different size T3, T4, T6 turbo housings or flanges. So then I can mount whatever turbo I want. Whether or not you have a V-band on the hot side is irrelevant. I don't think that's going to make any difference at all. So thank you guys all for showing up, and I will see you guys all tomorrow. And fairly soon, I might have a fairly cool announcement that you guys will actually get to vote on. Thanks for showing up. I will see you guys all tomorrow.